Page 41, Part 5, titled The Planes, subtitle Involution of Liberating Consciousness. When the consciousness of the soul is ripe for disentanglement from the gross world, it enters the spiritual path and turns inwards. Here we have note 2 of the supplement, entitled Practical Mysticism. Subtitle, Approach to Truth is Individual. There is no general rule or method applicable to all who aspire to realize God. Every man must work out his own salvation and must choose his own method, although his choice is mostly determined by the total effect of the mind impressions, sanskaras, acquired in previous lives. He should be guided by the creed of his conscience and follow the method that best suits his spiritual tendency, his physical aptitude, and his external circumstances. Truth is one, but the approach to it is essentially individual. The Sufis say, there are as many ways to God as there are souls of men. Parentheses, At turuku ilahi kunufusi bani Adam. And here we have a quote by Akbar, Jamal-i fitrat kelak partao, hubul partao kilak shakin, tarik irfan main kia bataun, yara kiski wara kiski. Translation, nature's beauty has thousands of facets for which there are thousands of ways and means of acceptance. Parentheses, understanding. In the path of gnosis, who can determine which particular mode or mood is earmarked for a given individual? Subtitle, Renunciation. When a pilgrim, and by pilgrim we mean here aspirant or disciple, feels drawn to renunciation, it means that the spirit of renunciation was already latent in him. This readiness results from the swinging of the terrible pendulum from pain to pleasure and pleasure to pain, in the countless forms of evolution, and in the countless entrances and exits through the doors of birth and death experienced during reincarnation. Because this spirit of renunciation is latent, it needs only some exciting cause to bring it to the surface. And it is only when it comes to the surface that we are able to see the power and nature of the latent spirit. If the latent spirit is simply a spiritual indigestion from a temporary surfeit of pain, combined with a mild desire for something more pleasant, the overt renunciation will be only of a fleeting and feeble kind, a mere temporary escape from unpleasantness. At its best, however, this latent spirit is a secret pact of aggression between an incurable disgust for the world and an ardent and burning thirst for God. When it comes to the surface, it shows itself as an invincible determination to marshal the entire being to the attainment of victory over the lower self, and to reject everything that is irrelevant to this great and terrible struggle. Note this word, quote, reject. It means that such a pilgrim casts aside irrelevancies. We might call renunciation the fruit of the flower of spiritual longing, fertilized by the pollen of disgust for the futility of endless births and deaths. Once renunciation expresses itself, there are many ways of looking at it, of which the simplest is to divide it into two main types, internal and external. External renunciation means giving up completely all worldly delights and physical attachments to material things. In the early stages, this renunciation is helpful to the extent to which it leads to internal renunciation and preoccupation with God. Tens of thousands of so-called sannyasis, parentheses, renunciators, are to be found in India, of whom far too many have adopted this external renunciation only as a profession that enables them to indulge in an unproductive life of idleness. External renunciation, however, can be and often is real. When this is so, it will inevitably lead on to internal renunciation, and this is the renunciation that matters. Internal renunciation means the control of desires at their very source, so that the mind does not fall a prey to the demands of lust, greed, and anger. This does not mean that one shall cease at once to have such thoughts. This is impossible, as such thoughts will continue to be troublesome as long as the sanskaras from which they arise are part of one's being. The fight is necessarily hard and long. For the West in particular, external renunciation is inadvisable and impractical. It should be internal and of the mind from the start. One should live in the world, perform all legitimate duties, and yet feel mentally detached from everything. One should be in the world, but not of it. The Sufis say, Dil bayar dast bikar, parentheses, the heart with God, the hands for work. Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, the perfect master of Delhi, was once asked by a visitor how one should live in the world. At that moment, it so happened that a few women were passing by with pitchers of water balanced on their heads, and as they walked, they gossiped and gesticulated. Pointing to them, Nizamuddin said, "Look at those women. That's how you should live in the world." Asked to explain this cryptic remark, the master continued, "These women returning from the well, with pitchers balanced on their heads, seem to be thinking of nothing else but exchanging tidbits of gossip with each other, and yet they are all the time concentrating on something far more important, on balancing the pitchers on their heads. Thus, whatever your body, your senses, or the purely surface part of your mind may be occupied with, see that the root of your mind is constantly focused on God." Subtitle, Vaitag and Vairagya. Vaitag and Vairagya. If we look upon renunciation as being a state of mind, we can understand how this state of mind may be either temporary or permanent. The former is known as Vaitag and the latter as Vairagya. Vaitag, parentheses, temporary renunciation, is simply a temporary disgust for the world and its affairs resulting from some shock, disappointment, or loss, combined with a vague desire for God, or it may come from a sudden impulse. In Vaitag, the mind turns away from the world and takes to godly ways, but this attitude is not lasting, and the mind returns to its old ways as soon as circumstances alter, or as soon as the impulse dies down. Vairagya, parentheses, irrevocable renunciation, however, is an attitude of mind involving such a longing for God and such a deep indifference to things worldly that once roused, it knows no retreat and is proof against all temptations to give it up. The famous example of Gautama Buddha is illustrative of Vairagya. We have already explained that renunciation is the overt expression of a latent desire for union with God, combined with a latent spirit of disgust for the world. And we used an analogy of flower, pollen, and fruit. As far as fertilization is concerned, the flower and the pollen by themselves are helpless, for the two can only be brought together by some outside agency, such as the wind, the bee, or the insect. Whether or not fertilization takes place in nature may depend upon so many thousands of unknown factors that modern science gives up trying to predict it and labels it chance. That, however, is beside the point at the moment, and in our analogy we shall think of this fertilization as a gift. To return to Vairagya, let us remember that the longing for union with God is latent in every living being. The longing for union with God is latent in every living being. However, it only pushes its way into consciousness when the soul approaches the beginning of what Meher Baba, in the Divine Theme, calls the realization process. The disgust for the world is also something that develops naturally in all of us, and which grows more and more powerful as we draw nearer to the beginning of this realization process. When the flower is in full bloom and the pollen ripe, the wind or the bee gives the gift of fertilization that produces the fruit. In the same way also, when this moment of inner readiness comes, a divine gift descends upon the soul, which fertilizes the longing for God and the disgust or indifference for the world, and so brings about the priceless fruit of Vairagya. This divine gift may be a touch of inner grace from the indwelling God, or it may be the result of contact with a saint or a perfect master. But it is always a gift. Vairagya, when it first becomes manifest, will almost certainly express itself for a time as an external renunciation. But Vairagya, being permanent, will always lead sooner or later to the real renunciation, which is internal. When an aspirant has such an intense longing for truth, he is qualified to enter the path. There is a story of a master who was pestered by a disciple as to when he would realize God. Once, when they went to bathe in a river, the master held the aspirant under water for a few moments. When the disciple was on the verge of suffocation, the master pulled him out and asked what he had thought of and longed for most while under the water. The aspirant replied, "Air." The master explained when the disciple had just as intense a longing for God, then realization would come. Maulana Rumi says, "Ab kamju tishnigi avar bidast." Call out for water less, but create thirst for it more. Call out for water less, but create thirst for it more. In the words of Meher Baba, the path begins with a conscious longing for a deeper reality. As the fish which is taken out of water longs to go back to the water, so the aspirant who has sensed the goal longs to be united with God. In fact, the longing to go back to the source is present in each being from the very time that it gets separated from the source by the veil of ignorance. But it is unconscious till the aspirant enters the path. Asterisk. Editor's note, see also Meher Baba, The Stages of the Path, Discourses, pages 128 to 134. Back to the text. The Sufis call this attitude of mind, quote, tauba, meaning repentance, and implying the turning away from or renouncing of the life of the senses for the life of the spirit. One who has taken this great step does not look back again at that which he has left behind. Meher Baba says that there may be 1,000 seekers enjoying as many spiritual experiences, but there is only one path of gnosis. It is an internal but an actual pathway. Though not an ordinary path, it is distinctly perceptible as such to the internal eye of the true pilgrim who travels along it. But even those mystics who have truly experienced can only explain the sections of the path that they themselves have traversed. Repeat that. But even those mystics who have truly experienced can only explain the sections of the path that they themselves have traversed. Those who have reached the critical point on the third plane can know nothing about the fourth plane, nor can they lead anyone up to their own level. Their knowledge and experience are limited to themselves. Only those on the fifth and sixth planes can bring others up to their own level, and anyone upon whom their grace descends will be greatly benefited. The individual souls of the world are within the limits of the gross sphere, which includes all the gross suns, moons, worlds, and all space. A savage ignorant of the most elementary scientific laws and of the code of right and wrong, and a great philosopher or scientist are both within the bounds of the gross sphere. The philosopher may be quite familiar in theory with the subtle sphere, and the scientist may be an authority on the extreme frontiers of modern physics, but from the standpoint of the subtle, they and the savage belong to the gross sphere. Until the subtle sphere is experienced, gnosis remains a subject for intellectual quibbling for all those belonging to the gross sphere, because by subtle we do not mean merely the finest form of the gross. In the ordinary sense of the word, it may be correct to call very fine substances such as ether, the atom, vibration, light, and space subtle, but they are unquestionably gross, though in a very fine form. Spiritually speaking, subtle means something completely different from the physical, however attenuated physical things may be. Although the gross sphere is the outcome of the subtle sphere and is dependent on it, the subtle sphere is completely independent of the gross sphere. As an example, we may take the act of eating. The gross act is the outcome of the thought and depends upon it, but the thought is independent of the physical act. Subtitle: Forgetfulness. The whole philosophy of approaching and realizing the truth hinges on the question of what we may call forgetfulness. The word forgetfulness used here must not be associated with its commonly accepted meaning of forgetting to post a letter or a state of mind that is simply dull and blank. Forgetfulness in this special sense is an attitude of mind that develops gradually into spiritual experience. External renunciation is not forgetfulness, because it is mostly physical and partly mental. But internal renunciation, when it becomes purely mental, does assume the quality and dignity of forgetfulness. Thus, one may renounce the world, but it is not so easy to forget it. Forgetfulness in this special sense thus explains the secret that lies behind all happiness, spiritual or otherwise, that human beings experience. The Sufi term for this forgetfulness is bikudi, and it should not be mixed up, though it often is, with bihoshi, unconsciousness. The difference between forgetfulness and unconsciousness is important, and a few examples of types of unconsciousness will help to make it clear. To begin with, one must remember that forgetfulness is the partial or total detachment of the mind from the physical world, and unconsciousness the partial or total deadening of the mind to the physical world. The former gives rise to various degrees of spiritual ecstasy, and the latter to various degrees of cessation of pleasure and pain. Let us then look at one or two examples of unconsciousness. In perfect health, one does not bother about the functioning of a vital organ like the heart. This means that one forgets that this organ is beating ceaselessly and perfectly in the human body for the maintenance of life and health. If, however, there is a disturbance in the cardiac rhythm, there is immediate discomfort, and if there is a cardiac infarct, there is immediate precordial pain. In either case, one is reminded that one has a heart. The sensation of discomfort or pain, though it rises from the heart, is felt only because of the functioning of the mind. The more the mind is directed to the heart, the more the discomfort or pain is felt. When pain reaches its climax, unconsciousness may supervene, a break in the threads of consciousness that enables one to forget the pain. But this is unconsciousness and not forgetfulness in its spiritual sense. A surgeon, by performing a prefrontal leucotomy, can interfere with some of the nervous pathways that serve this focusing of the mind on the intractable pain of some incurable disease like cancer. After this operation, the pain is still there, but the patient ceases to direct his mind towards it, and so ceases to bother about it. This again is a partial unconsciousness brought about by purely physical means, and not true forgetfulness in its spiritual sense. Sleep is a state of unconsciousness that affords a temporary respite from the wear and tear of life, but sleep is not true forgetfulness in its spiritual sense. The whole philosophy of happiness and unhappiness, therefore, hinges on the question of forgetfulness of some kind or another, and of remembrance of some kind or another. Remembrance is an attachment of the mind to a particular idea, person, thing, or place, and forgetfulness is its opposite. Once it is understood that remembrance causes pain, it follows that the only cure is some kind of forgetfulness, and this forgetfulness may be either positive or negative. The positive forgetfulness is one in which the mind remains aware of external stimuli, but refuses to react to them. The negative forgetfulness is either mere unconsciousness, a stopping of the mind as in sound sleep, or an acceleration of it as in madness, which has been defined as a way of avoiding the memory of suffering. Either sleep or madness may be artificially induced in various degrees by the use of intoxicants or drugs, but this also is a negative way of overcoming remembrance. Positive forgetfulness, then, is the cure, and its steady cultivation develops in man that balance of mind which enables him to express such noble traits as charity, forgiveness, tolerance, selflessness, and service to others. One who is not equipped with this positive forgetfulness becomes a barometer of his surroundings. His poise is disturbed by the slightest whisper of praise or flattery, and by the faintest suggestion of slander or criticism. His mind is like a slender reed swayed by the lightest breeze of emotion. Such a man is perpetually at war with himself and knows no peace. In the exercise of this positive forgetfulness, not only is non-reaction to adverse circumstances essential, but also non-reaction to favorable and pleasurable circumstances. Of these two, the latter is the harder and is less often described, although it matters just as much. Positive forgetfulness, although it lies at the very root of happiness, is by no means easy to acquire. Once a man attains this state of mind, however, he rises above pain and pleasure. He is master of himself. This forgetfulness, to be fully effective for the spiritual life, must become permanent, and such permanence is only acquired through constant practice during many lives. Some people, as a result of efforts towards forgetfulness in past lives, get spontaneous and temporary flashes of it in a later life. And it is such people who give to the world the best in poetry, art, and philosophy, and who make the greatest discoveries in science. In such moments of true forgetfulness, there is a mental detachment from all material surroundings in which the poet allows his imagination to soar. An artist, when he gives form to an ideal in which he completely forgets himself and all irrelevant surroundings, creates a masterpiece. The best of philosophy is uttered when a man surveys the problem of life without reference to the ups and downs of his purely personal circumstances. And some of the greatest scientific discoveries have been made in this same frame of mind. Such manifestations of genuine spontaneity of forgetfulness are very rare indeed, and although it is said that poets, artists, and philosophers are born and not made, these fleeting phases of real forgetfulness are the result of efforts made in past lives. In an attempt to make life bearable, some people develop a feeble kind of stoicism, a sort of, quote, who cares anyway, end quote, outlook. And others plunge recklessly into Epicureanism. The former is the apathetic acceptance of defeat, and the latter the effort to forget defeat in the arms of pleasure. Neither is true forgetfulness, but when a man acquires the true forgetfulness, he enters the spiritual kingdom and passes through different degrees of forgetfulness until the goal is reached. Meher Baba tells us, forgetfulness of the world makes one a pilgrim, parentheses, Rarav Sadhak. Forgetfulness of the next world makes one a saint. Forgetfulness of self means realization, and forgetfulness of forgetfulness is perfection. Back to part 5, the planes, involution of liberating consciousness. I'll just read that first sentence again. When the consciousness of the soul is ripe for disentanglement from the gross world, it enters the spiritual path and turns inwards. Its gross impressions now become less deep. They become fainter or more subtle, with the result that the soul now becomes subtle conscious. This is the first step in the involution of consciousness, which is striving for liberation from the burden of impressions. A number of cycles of births and deaths in the human form have to contribute towards that ripeness of gross experience, which ultimately propels the consciousness of the soul onto the path of liberating involution, on which impressions become fainter and fainter and eventually disappear. Gross impressions become subtle impressions become mental impressions, and mental impressions are ultimately wiped out, leaving consciousness free to reflect the truth. The process of involution is generally gradual. Man's heritage of form, as well as impressions, is from animals. So the gross impressions are very strong. In extremely rare cases, the gross impressions can suddenly disappear, and the freed consciousness of the soul experiences the oversoul. But it is more usual for the gross impressions to become fainter and fainter, thus getting converted into subtle and mental impressions, and then fade away completely. As a general rule, the soul, which has started on its homeward journey, does not come back to the gross world in which it had lost itself, as if in a wilderness. This does not mean that the subtle conscious soul does not take a gross form or dwell in the gross world with its gross body. It means that the consciousness of the soul is no longer entangled with the gross form or the gross world, and that it is chiefly engrossed in the subtle world. As a general rule, the soul first snaps its link with the gross world, then with the subtle world, and lastly with the mental world, and comes to realize itself as beyond all these. While it traverses this path, it crosses 6 planes, of which the first 3 belong to the subtle world. The 4th is on the borderline of the subtle and mental worlds, whereas the 5th and the 6th belong to the mental world. The soul, abiding everlastingly in the Oversoul, is beyond all planes. Subtitle: First and Second Planes. As the gross consciousness of the gross conscious human soul gradually involves, this involving gross consciousness experiences partially the first plane of the subtle world through the medium of the fully developed subtle body of the soul. Here we have note 3 of the supplement, which is titled The First Plane. Hafiz evidently refers to the first plane when he says, Kaz nadanist ki manziliga I maksud kujast, in kadar hast ki bang I jarasi miayad. Translation: It is not known where the real abode of the Divine Beloved is. Only this much is clear, that I hear the sound of bells. Parentheses, from the traveling caravans. On this subject of sound and the planes, Meher Baba says, asterisk, editor's note, questions Baba answers. Meher Baba Journal, Volume 1, Number 3, January 1939, pages 83 to 84. However, know this, that sound exists throughout all the 7 planes, differing in its expression of feeling, ecstasy, and bliss. The sound, sight, or smell of the higher planes can, with no stretch of the imagination, be likened to what we are used to on the physical plane. Our physical organs of hearing, seeing, and smelling are useless for experiencing and enjoying the higher planes. Therein it is a different eye that sees, a different ear that hears, and a different nose that smells. You know already that there are inner senses, counterparts of the external senses in man, and it is with the former that one experiences the higher planes. Avoid the mistake of likening the sound of the higher planes to something different in intensity and frequency of vibrations to the sound of the physical plane. Know it for a certainty that there is actually what may be called sound in the first three planes. The form, beauty, music, and bliss of this sound are beyond description. The nod, or celestial music, is peculiar to the first plane, which Hafiz refers to as Bang-i-Jarasi, parentheses, the ringing of bells. As stated above, although there is sound in all the 7 planes, it is smell that is peculiar to the second and third planes, while sight belongs to the 5th and 6th planes. The 7th plane stands unique. Here, the sound, sight, and smell are divine in essence and have no comparison to those emanating from the lower planes. In this plane, one does not hear, smell, or see, but one becomes sound, smell, and sight simultaneously and is divinely conscious of it. Back to the main text. I'll just repeat the sentence we left with. It's subtitled First and Second Planes. As the gross consciousness of the gross conscious human soul gradually involves, this involving gross consciousness experiences partially the first plane of the subtle world through the medium of the fully developed subtle body of the soul. At this stage, the involved gross consciousness of the gross conscious human soul, gets the first glimpses of the first plane of the subtle world, and experiences these glimpses or impressions partially through the gross body and partially through the subtle body. Here, both the gross and the subtle senses are used simultaneously. This is the stage when it is said that the human soul stands, as it were, on the line of demarcation, as shown in the sketch, asterisk, editor's note, facing page 55, which demarks the gross world from the subtle world. The consciousness of this human soul experiences strange things. With his gross eyes, he sees glimpses of the subtle plane. With his gross ears, he hears celestial music of the subtle plane. And with his gross nose, he enjoys subtle scents. In short, the gross conscious human soul, partially on the first plane of the subtle world, experiences subtle impressions with gross senses. Gradually, with further involution of gross consciousness, the gross conscious human soul experiences completely the first plane of the subtle world. Now the gross conscious human soul is no longer gross conscious, but he is subtle conscious. This subtle conscious human soul gradually becomes conscious of the second plane of the subtle world. Here we have note 4 of the supplement. which is subtitled The Second Plane, Hafiz evidently refers to the second plane when he says, Kiguyamat, ki bimai kani dushmast o karab, surush I alam I gaibam ki mujida dadast. Translation: How should I reveal to you that last night in the tavern, intoxicated and unsteady as I was, great good tidings were brought to me by the angel of the hidden world. This subtle world is the domain of infinite energy, the infinite power of God, which when translated into the finite, here manifests in the form of the infinite energy of the subtle world. When in human form the soul has subtle consciousness, it is unconscious of the body, gross, and mind, or the mental body. But it does work through the gross body and through the mind, mental body. Not directly, but on the subtle plane. So even if the subtle conscious human soul is unconscious of the gross body and mental body, and therefore does not realize the gross and mental worlds, he can use the gross body through various aspects of the gross, such as eating, drinking, sleeping, seeing, feeling, hearing, etc. And he can use the mental body through various aspects of mind, mental body, such as desires, thoughts, and emotions. The subtle conscious human soul on the second plane, with greater involution of consciousness, is gradually gaining consciousness of the infinite energy of the subtle world, and is capable of performing tricks or minor miracles of a lower degree. For instance, with one wish, he can make a dry tree green, and vice versa. He can stop railway trains and motor cars, fill a dry well with fresh water, and so on and so forth. This subtle conscious human soul on the second plane experiences the subtle world with the subtle senses of his subtle body. He is now totally unconscious of the gross world, although from all outward appearances he remains and functions as an ordinary man, eating, sleeping, and having feelings of pain and pleasure, etc. Yet actually, his involving consciousness experiences not the gross, but the subtle world, and creates fresh subtle impressions only of the sights, scents, and sounds of the subtle world. Third plane. Further involution of the subtle consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul makes the soul experience the third plane of the subtle world. Here we have note 5 of the supplement, which is subtitled or titled The Third Plane. Hafiz refers to the third plane in the following words. Ki ra mizanad in mutrib I mukam shinas. Ki dar mian I gazal kuli ashina avard. What perturbation and distress this musician, with knowledge of spiritual states and stages, is causing the listeners, lovers, by interpolating in the midst of his performance the words of the divine beloved. Back to the text. Here the subtle consciousness gains greater consciousness of the infinite energy of the subtle world, and the soul experiences greater finite power. Here he is capable of performing grand miracles, such as giving sight to the blind and restoring limbs to the maimed. Here this subtle conscious human soul is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle sphere, just as a gross conscious human soul is capable of traveling from Asia to Australia or America using the gross vehicles at his disposal. Here we have note number 6 of the supplement. Note 6 is titled The Stage Between the Third and Fourth Planes. The journey between the third and fourth planes is at once difficult and dangerous because between these two planes there is the point of enchantment, Mukam Hairat. It is very difficult to pass out of this state of enchantment if the pilgrim once stops there. Although most pilgrims pass directly from the third to the fourth plane, unless the pilgrim gets out of this state quickly and proceeds onwards to the fourth plane, his progress will be held up indefinitely. Once a pilgrim becomes thus enchanted, he remains so for days, months, or years together. He can neither make further progress nor can he retrogress. He is neither gross conscious nor subtle conscious. Neither can he be called unconscious because he is fully conscious of the enchantment, and it is because of this consciousness of the enchantment that he lives this living death. The physical condition of the deeply enchanted pilgrim is no less strange. For if he seats himself in a particular position, he remains in that position for months or years together. Similarly, if he becomes enchanted while standing, he will continue standing until the enchantment ends. In short, he remains stationary in the position in which he first becomes enchanted, and although he may appear to be a lifeless statue, he is in fact more alive than the ordinary man of the world. It is well known to the Sufi world how Ali Ahmed Sabir of Piran Kalyar, who afterwards became a perfect master, once remained standing for years near a certain tree. During this period, Sabir's mind was absorbed in the enchantment of this Mukam Hariyat, and he was delivered from it by a kutub. Only natural death or divine help from a living master can help such a dazed pilgrim out of his spiritual stalemate. A master would help such a pilgrim either by bringing him back to the third plane or by pushing him onwards. Hafiz no doubt thinks of this stage of the pilgrim when he says, Mastam kun an kunan ki nad an zi bikvudi dar arsi kiyal ki amad kudam raft. Make me so dazed and intoxicated that, on account of this state of forgetfulness, I should be oblivious of what came into my mind and what passed out of it. Meher Baba explains that a pilgrim runs the risk of entering Mukam Hairat, state of enchantment, when he passes from the third to the fourth plane. There are, he says, states of enchantment on other parts of the path also, but the most important is that between the third and the fourth planes. This Ha'irat, enchantment, may be strong or feeble. If there is no hitch or disturbing factor present at the moment that a pilgrim becomes enchanted, then the Ha'irat is deep or strong. If there is a disturbing factor present at that moment, then the Ha'irat is feeble. If a pilgrim experiences either strong or feeble Ha'irat between the third and fourth planes, and is then pushed forward by accident to a higher plane, he invariably goes to a position between the fifth and sixth planes, again with the same strong or feeble Hayrat. However, such instances are very rare. Ali Ahmed Sabir of Kalyar and Baba Abdur Rahman of Bombay both were precipitated from a very strong Hayrat between the third and fourth planes into a very strong Hayrat between the fifth and sixth planes, the former by a gift of grace from a kutub, and the latter through God's gift in the shape of an accident. A complete fixity of posture that lasts until death, or until a perfect master is contacted, is seen only in those pilgrims who have a very strong Hayrat. A must, parentheses, God intoxicated, who has been with Meher Baba for many years, was in this Mukam-e-Hayrat between the third and fourth planes when he was brought to Meher Baba in Rahuri in 1936. But his Hayrat was feeble, and although he would stand for many hours at a stretch in one position, this position would not be maintained permanently. The enchantment of Ali Ahmed Sabir, however, was a strong one, and he remained in one posture until he was finally delivered from the enchantment by a kutub. This state of enchantment should on no account be confused with the catatonic stupor of a schizophrenic, although it may appear similar. Both are states of enchantment, but they are poles apart. Back to the text. Where are we? Okay, I'll just read that last sentence. Here, this subtle, conscious human soul is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle sphere, just as a gross conscious human soul is capable of traveling from Asia to Australia or America using the gross vehicles at his disposal. The second and third planes of the subtle sphere are the two major planes which are solely in the domain of the subtle sphere. The first plane is partially in the domain of the subtle sphere and partially in the gross sphere. Similarly, the fourth plane is partially of the subtle sphere and partially of the mental sphere. This fourth plane is known as the threshold of the mental sphere. Fourth plane. With a gradual and further gain in the involution of the consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul, the consciousness of the soul inclines the soul to experience the fourth plane. On the fourth plane, the soul is fully conscious of infinite energy. It is the very same infinite energy which is the shadowy aspect of that infinite power of God. Here the soul is equipped with full power and is even capable of raising the dead and creating new forms and worlds breathing with life. Asterisk. Editor's note. The Vijnan conscious souls of Kutub state, or perfect masters, control such a happening and see that such gross mishaps do not come to pass unless preordained. On the fourth plane there are no occult powers, they are divine powers. As shown in the sketch facing page 55, the subtle conscious human soul on the fourth plane, possessing the key to the store of infinite power, is seen on the threshold of the mental world, confronted by the full blast of intense desires and emotions which are the aspects of mind of the mental world. At this stage, the soul experiences, as it were, a state of the darkest night. He finds himself caught up between the devil and the deep. The overpowering incitement by intense desires to wield and use this infinite energy at will proves a treacherous foe at this juncture, when the involution of consciousness of this subtle conscious human soul is unfailingly progressing rapidly towards gaining mastery over all desires. If these desires at their zenith overpower the soul on the fourth plane, and if the powers are misused, then the experience of liberating this infinite energy invariably proves fatal at this juncture for the soul on the fourth plane. The result is that all of the consciousness gained by the soul is violently disintegrated, and the soul retains only the most finite consciousness and identifies itself once again, with the stone form. This soul then has to pass through the whole process of evolution from the stone form onward to regain full consciousness. The soul of the fourth plane has semi-subtle and semi-mental impressions. He is subject to most tantalizing temptations because he has intense and overpowering desires, good or bad. Being in possession of tremendous power, he is impelled to make good or bad use of it. If he misuses his power for the satisfaction of lust, or for the sake of craving for name and fame, or for some other low purpose, there is a sudden fall of this consciousness of the soul, causing it to revert to the stone stage of consciousness. But if by overcoming his temptations he makes good use of his tremendous powers, or does not make any use of his powers, he goes into the fifth plane, where he is safe and has no possibility of downfall. But also, if he makes good use of the powers, he is sometimes pulled up into the sixth plane by the Vijnan conscious souls of Kutub state, or perfect masters. Parentheses, but not Jivan Muktas nor Majzubs. Good use of power in the gross world may be directed towards material and spiritual ends. For example, wealth might be spent for the material well-being of others, as for charitable hospitals, relief for the starving and the distressed, etc., or for their spiritual well-being by providing them with spiritual instruction and spiritual possibilities. But in the fourth plane, good use of powers invariably consists in harnessing them only for the spiritual well-being of others. These powers can never be used to bring about material prosperity for anyone. That definitely is a bad use. We might take the following as an example of good use of the powers of the fourth plane. Suppose a spiritual pilgrim is going through a desert and is on the point of death due to unquenchable thirst. The soul of the fourth plane can appear to him in the gross body and give him relief by giving him a jug of water and then disappear. Such use can be termed good use. Powers can be used for individual or collective good, but even good use binds and arrests the further progress of the soul. That is why the fourth plane is the most difficult to cross and is fraught with greatest dangers. The person who is stationed on the fourth plane finds it most difficult to abstain from wielding the tremendous powers at his command for the fulfillment of his overpowering desires. The fourth plane is the threshold of the mental world. On this plane, more than on any other subtle plane, the spiritual pilgrim is particularly susceptible to having a precipitous fall. The crisis which confronts the soul of the fourth plane is grave and hazardous, because he comes into the possession of stupendous divine powers before having brought his mind into complete subjugation. He cannot control his mind completely because, unless and until he rises onto the fifth plane, which of the mental world, he cannot directly experience or use his mind. Like the gross conscious human soul, the subtle conscious soul of the fourth plane also uses his mind indirectly. Now on this fourth plane the mind is fully alive. It is functioning in all its fully developed aspects of thoughts, feelings, and desires, which are at the zenith of their overwhelming intensity. On the one hand, the soul is trying to gain mastery over its own insurgent mind and bring into subjugation the subversive forces of desires let loose. On the other hand, the limitless energy of the planes is completely at his disposal and is constantly seeking some expression or use. If the soul yields to the overpowering temptations to put his powers to wrong use, there is an enormous psychic crash of unimaginable magnitude. The explosive forces thereby released bring about a complete disintegration of consciousness, subjecting it to a cataclysmic downfall from the heights of the subtle consciousness of the fourth plane to the very lowest depths of rudimentary stone consciousness, which the soul experienced in the very beginnings of evolution. This psychic cataclysm of disintegration is comparable to the fusing of an electric bulb due to an irreparable short circuit. The fallen soul has now no alternative except that of again going through the long and laborious ascent of evolving consciousness, through ages of evolution and reincarnation, through numberless forms, and then again gradually and patiently ascending through the planes. This disintegration of consciousness occurs only in the case of fourth plane consciousness, and that too rarely, only when the powers of the fourth plane are misused. It is a fact, normally, that when consciousness is once gained, it can never be lost. But the case of the fourth plane consciousness is the one exception. If the soul does not misuse the powers at his command, but uses them for good without being overpowered by desires, then with further involution of consciousness, the consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul sometimes experiences directly the sixth plane of the mental world and skips over the experiences of the fifth plane of the mental world. Asterisk. Entry into the mental world comprising the fifth and sixth planes may be compared to an entry into a room after crossing the threshold, the fourth plane of consciousness. But if this consciousness of soul on the fourth plane of consciousness neither uses or misuses the powers of the fourth plane, then gradually, with further involution of consciousness, the subtle conscious human soul on the fourth plane crosses the threshold of the fourth plane and enters the mental world on the fifth plane. Fifth and sixth planes. With greater involution of consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul on the fourth plane, the consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul identifies itself with mind of the mental planes and experiences the mental world. This mind of the mental planes has two sections. In the first section, the state of mind is inquiring or reflecting. In this state, mind functions as thoughts, high thoughts, low thoughts, good thoughts, bad thoughts, material thoughts, spiritual thoughts, and so forth. In the second section, the state of mind is impressive or sympathetic. In this state, mind functions as feelings, feelings of sufferings, emotions, feelings of desires, longings, feelings of pangs, separation, and so forth. When mind of the mental world has distinct dual functions, it is necessary that the experiences in the field of mind, i.e. the mental world, must be distinctively of two kinds also. Thus the mental world has two domains, the domain of the fifth plane of consciousness of thoughts and the domain of the sixth plane of consciousness of feelings. Asterisks. The difference between the involving consciousness of the fifth and sixth planes may be compared to the difference between the angles of vision of a man entering a room, the mental world. On entering the room, if the man looks straight ahead of him, he spontaneously sees God face to face, thereby gaining directly consciousness of the sixth plane. But if his vision happens to focus on one of the corners of the room, then he first gains only the consciousness of the fifth plane. Therefore, the consciousness of the mental conscious human soul on the fifth plane identifies with the first section of mind only and is conscious of that state of mind which is inquiring or reflecting mind. Here we have the number 7 note of the supplement. And it's titled Pilgrim of the Mental Sphere. Meher Baba says that if a pilgrim of the mental sphere is in India and conceives the idea of seeing America, simultaneous with the wish on his part, either mentally or physically, as he wishes, he will be there. One may ask how he travels as fast as thought itself. The answer is that the mind is everywhere, and therefore the pilgrim of the mental sphere does not have to travel. He can be anywhere he likes without using his gross or subtle organs. He can know anything and everything about the gross, subtle, and mental spheres as far as the sixth plane, simply by willing to know. More important still, he can help less advanced souls and also ordinary human beings to come up to his own level of progress. When he wants to help anyone directly, the pilgrim of the fifth plane can lead an aspirant, quote, by the hand, along the path. When he does so, the aspirant himself also perceives internally the continual presence of the master of the mental plane, known to Sufis as a wali, and also feels himself being actually led by him along the path to perfection. Hafiz, in the following couplet, evidently visualizes the particular sensation of one who is being led in this way. Tu gastu shu e kizaripe kujasti kiman. Piadi miravam o hamrahan savaranand. O august Master, lead me by the hand, because I am traversing the path on foot, (helplessly), as compared with other companions who are riding along it. Generally, however, a wali, Mahapurush, helps an aspirant by gazing into his eyes, thereby tearing away the inner veil from the real eye within. This spiritual influence of the wali through sight is known to Sufis as tawajjuh. The term tawajjuh does not apply to perfect masters. In their case, the term, quote, will is correct, for they can also render this help without the physical contact that is necessary in the case of masters of the planes. Meher Baba explains that on the fifth plane, the pilgrim sometimes desires to have the divine presence, and sometimes attends to worldly duties. In fact, so far as divine presence on the fifth plane is concerned, God is always present, but the pilgrim may not always desire this presence when he turns his attention to worldly duties. On the sixth plane, the pilgrim persists in desiring the presence of God 100%. Hafiz evidently refers to this experience of the fifth plane when he says, Hujuri garhami kvalu, azu gayib mashu Hafiz. O Hafiz, if you desire the divine presence, then do not allow yourself to be absent. Back to the text. We'll read the sentence that we stopped at again. Therefore, the consciousness of the mental conscious human soul on the fifth plane identifies with the first section of mind only, and is conscious of that state of mind which is inquiring or reflecting mind. Thus, this mental conscious human soul of the fifth plane is the creator and master of thoughts, and is capable of controlling only the thoughts of all gross and subtle conscious souls. This is often misinterpreted as controlling the minds of all gross and subtle conscious souls. Parentheses, he does not control the mind as a whole, but controls only that state of mind which functions as thoughts only. The mental conscious human soul on the fifth plane of consciousness, while identifying himself as inquiring or reflective mind, emanates only thoughts, does not identify himself with the second state of mind, and is therefore incapable of establishing mastery over feelings, emotions, and desires. However, with greater involution of consciousness, the mental conscious human soul on the fifth plane gains consciousness of the second state of mind, of the mental world in the sixth plane, and thus tends to identify himself as that mind in the second state, the impressive or sympathetic mind. Thus the consciousness of the mental conscious human soul has involved sixth plane consciousness of the mental world. The mental conscious human soul of sixth plane consciousness experiences the mental world through complete consciousness of feelings, and thus has no thoughts at all, but actually feels that he is conscious of the feeling of seeing God face to face continuously in everything and everywhere. He sees God continuously, but cannot see himself in God as God. Asterisk, this is not to be confused with our ordinary way of seeing an object with our ordinary eyes. To see God face to face is to apprehend God through the one and only sense of the mental plane, and this sense is of seeing. Here the pilgrim has the intuitive recognition of God. Therefore, he cannot reconcile his feeling of sight of God with his own identity with God, and thus he longs for, feels for, has pangs for union with God, whom he sees face to face. This identification with the second state of mind, feeling, is the predominant aspect of divine love, which ultimately leads to union with God. The fifth plane of the mental world is the state of full consciousness of thought, hence only mastery over the control and creation of thoughts is established, whereas no mastery nor control over feelings or emotions and desires is established. The sixth plane of the mental world is the state of full consciousness of feeling, and thus mastery over the control and creation of feelings is established, and no more scope is left for even a single thought to penetrate into the domain of feelings. The sixth plane consciousness is thoughtless and governs the feelings of the gross and subtle conscious souls. This is often misinterpreted as mastery over the hearts of all gross and subtle conscious souls. Parentheses, a soul with sixth plane consciousness does not govern or regulate the so-called heart, but controls and governs that state of mind in the mental plane which emanates feelings of emotion and desires. The loving of God and the longing for his union is really and fully demonstrated in the sixth plane. When even the sixth plane of the mental world is transcended, illusion vanishes and God is realized. In the human form, when the soul is mental conscious, it is unconscious of the gross body and the subtle body. See also Meher Baba, Mental Consciousness, the Everything and the Nothing. Pages 101, 104. In the human form, when the soul is mental conscious, it is unconscious of the gross body and the subtle body. But it does work through the gross and subtle bodies, not directly, but on the mental plane. So even if the mental conscious human soul is unconscious of the gross body and the subtle body, and therefore does not realize the gross and subtle worlds, he can unconsciously utilize the gross through various aspects of the gross, and is thus seen eating, drinking, sleeping, seeing, hearing, and feeling as an ordinary gross conscious human being, though he is all the while conscious only of the mental world, with his mental sense of seeing. Similarly, he can unconsciously utilize the subtle Similarly, he can unconsciously utilize the subtle through various gross aspects of energy in the form of nuclear energies, etc., while all the time being only conscious of seeing with his mental sense. The mental conscious human soul in the mental world has now only one sense, and that is of seeing. So this mental conscious human soul on the fifth plane experiences the first state of the mental world with the mental body or the mind and gains consciousness of the first state of mind. Here this soul is capable of controlling the first state of mind, parentheses, i.e. thoughts of the gross conscious and subtle conscious human souls, but is now totally incapable of performing any miracles because of his total unconsciousness of the infinite energy of the subtle world and its powers. However, as this mental conscious human soul controls the first state of mind of the subtle conscious human souls, the incitement in the subtle conscious human soul to perform miracles is checked, controlled, or aggravated according to the desire and will of the mind of the mental conscious human soul, who is capable of creating and controlling thoughts of other minds and is himself stable and can never again slide down to any lower level of consciousness. Gradually, as the involution of the consciousness of the mental conscious human soul progresses deeper and deeper, he experiences mastery over the second state of mind, i.e. feeling, and he now becomes fully conscious of the mind or the mental body and experiences the whole of the mental body on the sixth plane. Here we have the note number 8, titled The Sixth Plane. The traveler who succeeds in reaching this plane is entitled to be called a peer or Satpurush. There is no adequate translation of these words in English. The word saint would perhaps do, but it suffers from the handicap of very loose usage. Hafiz remembers this sixth plane in the following words: Madar piali aksiruch I yardidi im e bikabar zilazati shurbi mudam ima. We have seen the face of the beloved reflected in the cup of our mind or heart. O ignorant one, no notion have you of the bliss that we imbibe therefrom. Back to the text. Gradually, I'll repeat the last sentence, gradually as the involution of the consciousness of the mental conscious human soul progresses deeper and deeper, he experiences mastery over the second state of mind, i.e. feeling, and he now becomes fully conscious of the mind or the mental body and experiences the whole of the mental body on the sixth plane. This experience is of seeing God face to face, seeing God everywhere and in everything. Right from the first plane up through the sixth plane, the involution of consciousness progresses gradually and steadily as the consciousness of the soul had less and less frequent experiences of multifarious and diverse opposite impressions, which grew fainter and fainter. Therefore, while the involution of the soul's consciousness was in progress, the diverse opposite impressions became gradually scarcer and fainter until the involved consciousness of the soul on the sixth plane is fully conscious of the mental body and experiences the mental world in full with practically no impressions at all, except a faint last trace of residual impressions of opposites. That is, the involved consciousness fully identifies with mind, and the soul tends to realize that he is mind. And this soul, as mind, has a last and total impression that he sees God face to face in everything, but he cannot see himself in God. This mental, conscious human soul of the sixth plane, almost void of all impressions and only conscious of mind, now is confronted with God face to face and sees God in everything, but does not see himself in God because, being still conscious of mind, he takes himself as mind. Asterisk, like an aching tooth that gradually works loose but does not fall out for a long time, the false ego remains until the last stage of the first spiritual journey, although it becomes increasingly faint as the soul advances on the path, only to vanish forever in the final fauna of the seventh plane, to be replaced by the unlimited real ego. So read the sentence in the text again. This mental, conscious human soul of the sixth plane, almost void of all impressions and only conscious of mind, now is confronted with God face to face and sees God in everything, but does not see himself in God, because, being still conscious of mind, he takes himself as mind. This mental, conscious human soul associates himself with mind and is conscious of himself as mind, and experiences himself as still something other than God. This mental, conscious human soul on the sixth plane actually sees God face to face more vividly and intensively than the gross or subtle conscious human soul sees objects of the gross or subtle worlds. At this stage, the consciousness of the soul, which had experienced diverse, innumerable, and opposite impressions, now experiences the last trace of dual impressions of the opposites. This mental, conscious human soul on the sixth plane is still conscious of duality, identifying himself as mind, and differentiating himself from God. Here we have the ninth note of the supplement. It's titled Gnosis of the Sixth Plane. Concerning the gnosis of the sixth plane, Meher Baba tells us, only God exists, and if anything exists due to ignorance, its reality is illusory. It then exists as God's shadow, which means that God is both in the stage of knowledge and ignorance. The following four angles of the one experience, written in the language of Sufi gnosis, are different aspects of gnosis of souls in the sixth plane, when they are face to face with God, but still in the domain of duality. All of these aspects are experienced together at the same time. Number 1, Hama Ust. This means everything is He, and for one who experiences this gnosis, only God exists. 2, Hama Azust. This means everything is from Him, and for one who experiences this gnosis, all phenomena of diversities and manyness exist as illusion when ignorance prevails. Number 3, Hama Ba'ust. This means everything is with Him, and for one who experiences this gnosis, God is both attributeless and with attributes. His attributes are unlimited when knowledge prevails, and limited when ignorance prevails. Body, mind, and the three worlds do not exist, but if they seem to exist, they exist as shadows. Number 4, Hama Darust. This means everything is in Him, and for one experiencing this gnosis, even ignorance has no reality in itself. Its existence, when expressed, comes out of God's unconscious and infinite knowledge. And so whatever exists in duality due to ignorance has come out of God where it everlastingly existed. So back to the text of the planes. Seventh plane. This experience of duality lingers on and on until the final involution of consciousness of the mental conscious human soul leads the soul to dissociate itself from the mind. The consciousness of the mind had objectified God and makes the soul associate itself with its own self, the soul or Atma. Thus, the consciousness of the soul is now said to experience, at last, the consciousness of the seventh plane. Here on the seventh plane, the self-conscious human soul is conscious of himself as God and experiences infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss. For the mental conscious human soul to cross the sixth plane and experience the seventh plane by his own efforts is quite impossible. Asterisk. However, those in the sixth plane of consciousness realize God at the time of dropping their bodies. And we also have note 10 of the supplement, titled The Seventh Plane. It should be understood that at the moment of being merged into the seventh plane, all links with the gross, subtle, and mental bodies and with the universe are necessarily snapped. In ordinary gross existence, there is no parallel to this snapping of these long-enduring, vital connections that bind the individual to his three bodies and to the universe. Physical death is, by comparison, an insignificant thing, about as significant as the snapping of a piece of string. Ordinarily, at the instant of death, the subtle body and vital force are separated completely from the gross body. But the mind maintains the connection with the gross body for the first 4 days after death and, to a slighter degree, for 7 days more after that. In the final annihilation, Fana, however, the separation is not between body and mind. It is the actual annihilation of mind and of all nukush ek amal sanskaras. Back to the text. So I'll just read the final sentence again that we were at. For the mental conscious human soul to cross the sixth plane and experience the seventh plane by his own efforts is quite impossible. At this stage, the grace of a perfect master is absolutely essential to help the mental conscious human soul to dissociate himself from the consciousness of mind and to make him realize his unity with the infinite state, to experience infinite bliss consciously, and to realize that he, Atma, was eternally in bliss. So it is that the self-conscious human soul of the seventh plane is now fully conscious of the self as infinite and eternal, and is now also conscious of the source of energy and mind, which were nothing but the shadowy aspects of his own infinite power and infinite knowledge. This self-conscious human soul, which is now self-realized or God-realized, not only experiences infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, but simultaneously radiates them. Sometimes, in certain cases, such self-conscious human souls also make use of this infinite power, knowledge, and bliss directly and consciously for the emancipation of other souls from their impressions and their respective associations with the gross, subtle, and mental forms and worlds. In its travail to gain self-consciousness, the individual eternal Atma, soul, unconscious of its infinite state in Paramatma, gathered and experienced innumerable diverse impressions and all the while associated itself with finite and ephemeral existences, unfurling the gross, subtle, and mental worlds while evolving gross consciousness of the gross world and while involving consciousness of the subtle and mental planes of the subtle and mental worlds. Involution of consciousness of the Atma, soul, culminated by the grace of a perfect master, led the Atma to self-realization of its infinite state in Paramatma. Asterisk. Savbar tahir daman ha thon mire aya. Jab ank kuli dika apna hi gariban hai. That's by Oscar. Translation: 100 times I felt that I held your garment firmly in my hands. When I opened my eyes, I was amazed to discover it was my own garment that I was holding. Thus it is that when the consciousness of the Atma gained self-consciousness and experienced infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, the Atma realized that it exists eternally, that all through the travail to gain self-consciousness, the impressions, experiences, and associations of the gross, subtle, and mental bodies and worlds were nothing but a vacant dream, and that the identification with gross bodies, creatures, and human beings, and all the experiences of the three worlds and the six planes, with all of their paraphernalia, had their relative existences sustained and maintained as long as the consciousness of the Atma was immature. Maturity was only gained in the seventh plane, with consciousness fully involved. This led the Atma to realize the self, or made the Atma fully conscious of God realization. In other words, the Atma's own infinite state in Paramatma was consciously realized. Editor's note: the God-realized man is the Almighty, plus knowledge and consciousness. He is in the perfect wakeful state. He is knowledge, knower, and the known. He is love, lover, and the beloved. He knows that he is in every Jivatma and that everyone is in him. The God-realized man knows that he is the be-all and the end-all of existence, and that he always was and will remain the same one, infinite ocean of truth. But the ordinary man does not know whence he came and whither he will go. It is only after the final annihilation of the mind and the wearing out of the curtain of mental impressions that consciousness can function in full freedom from all impressional bindings. This means crossing the deep abyss which separates the sixth plane from the seventh plane. The seventh plane is the formless abode of the highest of the high. Editor's note: the reader is referred to Faridun Attar's Mantik ut Tayr, a Sufi allegory generally known as the Conference of the Birds, for a delightful description of the journey through the plains. The Most High, or the Infinite God as truth, can be realized only by transcending the entire realm of imagination. Only on this seventh plane does the soul fulfill the initial urge for self-knowledge by experiencing its own self as identical with the unchanging, eternal, indivisible, and formless Oversoul, with infinite knowledge, infinite reality, truth, infinite power, and infinite bliss. Next we have chart 1, the planes and worlds. At the top we have God, infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. Seventh plane, there's consciousness of self, experiences consciously infinite power, knowledge, bliss. Sixth and fifth planes are of the mental world, domain of mind. There's no power. Fully conscious of the sixth plane is fully conscious of the second state of mind and master of minds of all, the creator and controller of feelings, desires, and emotions. Fifth plane is conscious of the first state of mind, i.e. thoughts, and controls only thoughts. Fourth plane is the threshold to the fifth plane, fully conscious of energy, full power, and threatened by the overpowering aspects of mind. We have the subtle world, the domain of energy now. Third plane gains greater consciousness of energy. Third, second, and first plane all have power. Second plane gains consciousness of energy, and first plane, with gross nose, eyes, ears, experiences subtle smell, sights, and music. And at the bottom is the gross world, includes universes visible and invisible. Number A, imbibing energy from subtle world through gross aspects of energy such as nuclear, solar, etc. Number B, imbibing the aspects of mind of the mental world such as desires, thoughts, and emotions. Brings us to the end of the chapter on the planes.